Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 171, June 24th to June 30th, 1864. Last week, we finally reached Petersburg. While Cold Harbor is sometimes considered to be the end of the overland campaign, we can shed no doubt that this final move to the Cockade City will be certainly the end of that campaign and the beginning of the long siege of Petersburg. With Grant having shifted his army to the south of Richmond, we'll check in on further campaigning in Georgia. Of course, before we do that, though, we do need to talk about some Patreon content, and this month we did post our picture slideshow for the battlefield of Cold Harbor, so we have some pictures up there, talk a little bit about what you can see there today in that posting. And then we are getting pretty close to July, and July we'll be going back to a movie review. That's going to be Cold Mountain. So Cold Mountain has a pretty interesting scene in the beginning. It depicts the Battle of the Crater, something that we will be covering here at the end of the month, so might be a good prep for that episode. If that sounds like something that would interest you, we have a whole bunch of other movie reviews, memoir reviews as well, and picture slideshows. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. Of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off in Georgia, Johnson had given up a lot of ground. In an interesting contrast to Grant, in the main theater of the war, Sherman has continued to flank the smaller Confederate army out of its positions, although that comparison might be entirely fair, as we have seen Grant do that in Virginia, albeit after making contact with costly frontal assaults. There's usually a debate if you look into source materials about whether Sherman is this great mastermind and whether Grant is simply not on par, or, who's the better tactician, right? Well, it is pretty important, I think, in my opinion, that the armies in which they are facing are quite different. Johnson is not the same individual that Lee is. Lee is not as defensive-minded. He doesn't like acting defensively. Johnson feels more comfortable that way, and maybe there would have been some sort of effort if Lee was switched with Johnson to make things a little bit more difficult for Sherman. So there's always this debate of which campaign is better, and why can't Grant do the same thing that Sherman is doing? You see that a lot. As it was, though, the Confederate Army was alarmingly close to Atlanta now. Seemingly good defensive position after good defensive position was abandoned without much show. At the very least, in the main theater of the war, there was a perception that Lee was still winning battles, as he was essentially getting the upper hand. Grant was just going to continue in his dogged pursuit. In Georgia, there is not even something like that to hang your hat on. By this stage in the war, Resaca is a smaller affair, and that has been the largest battle the two armies have fought. So while there have been no huge losses, the South was becoming anxious with the fact that there was continual retreating. Such was the case as the two armies settled into lines once again in the mountains a little north of Atlanta. Initially, on the Lost Mountain line, Johnson would have part of his command situated on Pine Mountain, roughly a mile in front of his main position. Troops under William Bate would occupy this high ground and briefly skirmish with the advancing Union Army. Federal artillery would set up at the base of the mountain and have a good view of the Confederate works. Johnson would ride out to inspect the position, accompanied by Hardee and Leonidas Polk. The artillery would target the group of officers, initially missing them with a few rounds, before one would pass through the chest of Leonidas Polk, killing him instantly. The Union gunners were informed of their success as they had deciphered the rebel signal flags, and they were aware of what happened. Now Polk is an interesting figure. It might be unfair of me to say, you probably really only remember him for his squabbles with Bragg, and maybe his proposed flank movement that never was during the Tullahoma campaign, or maybe almost riding into the Union lines at Perryville. Regardless, at this point in the war, both sides are going to be needy for general officers who have experience commanding large groups of men. Polk certainly had that experience, so his loss would be felt by the rebels. William Wing Loring would take over the Corps, or otherwise the Army of Mississippi, following the death of the bishop. There's always this great, what-if scenario. Leonidas Polk is probably not going to be tabbed with Army Command, but he actually might in the events that we will soon see, and how things might have been different. I don't know, right? It might have been much the same. Maybe there would not have been as many rash attacks as there will be, but maybe there would have been. So it is a kind of an interesting what if. Also interesting, I do want to mention here as well, is that if you go to the site on Pine Mountain where Leonidas Polk was killed, there is a brief monument, a very small monument to him on this mountain, and it's essentially in this residential neighborhood. So kind of gives you an idea of, especially in the Atlanta campaign, and there's a common theme, again, if you look at source material, how in the Atlanta campaign, there is not as much in terms of battlefield preservation. So you kind of go into this cul-de-sac kind of looking thing, and you walk behind somebody's house, essentially into their backyard, and there's a monument to a Civil War general back there. So gives you an idea of what it's like to go down there and see these sites that probably have not been preserved as, say, the main theater of the war in the East, right? Johnson would pull his troops back to a new line anchoring his right at Kennesaw Mountain. Now, there were two mountains, actually, Big and Little Kennesaw, with Pigeon Hill sitting a little to the south. Big Kennesaw would rise some 600 feet, so it was most imposing. Rebel positions, especially artillery, would be placed on this key ground. Salients would be formed in the Confederate line as a result of the terrain. As the rebel line snaked further south and crossed over the Dallas Road, there would be additional elevation known as Cheatham's Hill, as it was Cheatham's troops who would occupy it. Here would be another angle known as the Dead Angle. Further south would be the Powder Springs Road, and a little to the west, Kolb's Farm. Johnson would be wary of another potential flanking attempt. He would shift John Bell Hood's corps to his flank to stop any potential thrusts. Hooker and the area around Kolb's Farm had dug in, and unbeknownst to Hood, who was not familiar with the area, these were pretty strong positions. The 14th Kentucky and 123rd New York would advance beyond the main Union works on the 22nd of June to reconnoiter. Encountering rebel skirmishers, Hood would decide to launch Stevenson and Hindman at the Federals, perhaps preempting a thrust by the Federals, and perhaps maybe, as some have said, trying to copy Robert E. Lee's style of warfare. You can kind of feel for the former general from the Army of Northern Virginia, as he had spent the night shifting to the opposite flank, and Hooker and Schofield might have been threatening toward Marietta, but also might have been attacking up the Powder Springs Road, which is where he was just coming from. So you get the idea, right, that the Union troops could be in a position where they are flanking you, right? You are unfamiliar with the area. You were just getting into this position. You've been told that this is an option that's probably on the table for the Federals, and that they could be attacking up this road. So if you are John Bell Hood and you are an aggressive commander, you are going to say, well, I'm going to launch a spoiling attack that's going to stop any kind of incursion into the flank here. His uncoordinated attack would be torn up by artillery and the well-entrenched Federals. In fact, artillery would be well placed and smash Stevenson's command. Hooker's men so far had been involved in some bloody repulses of their own, so they were more than happy to return the favor. Rebels would seek cover in ravines before the main Union line, the attack not really getting off at all. Hood would eventually withdraw and dig in. Hooker, for his part, did not press the advantage, believing that all of Johnson was in front of him. This would lead Sherman to reprimand him for not pressing, and maybe there could have been a bigger victory. Not only did he falsely believe he was facing the entire rebel army, but also mentioned how Schofield was not protecting his flank, a fact that Schofield refuted. Additionally, Butterfield's command had not even been engaged, all marks against the hero of Lookout Mountain. Hood, for his part, seems to not have received criticism from his superior until after the war. He attacked without letting him know, and indeed, as mentioned, without proper understanding of the strategic situation. Culp's Farm would rack up 1,500 rebels compared to 250 Union troops, so a very costly affair for the Southerners. After the brief action, the two sides would hunker down once again. So on the 26th of June, the two armies would settle into their lines, with Sherman gearing up for an attack. Now, why he decided the time was ready for an assault was not entirely clear. He had made good headway, at little loss, so far moving his troops around the Confederates. Maybe wishing to have a decisive victory after being dissatisfied with the course of the campaign, and also maybe wanting to emulate Grant with an all-out attack, he would decide to launch at the rebels on the 27th after conferring with his generals. On the northern end of the line, Blair and Dodge would demonstrate holding down Loring. This would be the point of Sherman's operation, prevent the Confederates from reinforcing other parts of the line. Logan, with divisions under Smith and Osterhaus, would shift to connect with Thomas and attack in the Pigeon Hill area. Howard's 4th Corps would also attack, along with Palmer's 14th Corps, facing off against Hardee. Schofield would try to flank around Hood on the rebel left, hoping to either find a weak point somewhere or roll the entire rebel line as to avoid the tougher terrain at the mountain was the name of the game. Artillery would open up on the 27th to soften the Confederates before the assault. The rebels, for their part, were conserving ammunition, so they were not returning fire. Just as a note, and we have said it before, is that the preemptive artillery strikes to any kind of infantry action, in our mind, might seem like a good idea, right? It's because we're thinking about it maybe more in terms of, say, World War I, World War II, but in the Civil War, it's never really going to be all that effective, and it's not really all that effective at Kennesaw Mountain. The other thing we can mention is that when Sherman is trying to emulate Grant, right, we have seen this before. We've seen this kind of attack before, and maybe kind of a flip-flopped, sort of, we're coming in from a different direction, right? But at Vicksburg, we kind of saw the same thing, right? We saw in those initial assaults how the entire army was going to attack Pemberton's force and their defenses. It was not going to allow for the Confederates to shift anybody around so that they couldn't meet any potential threat. Any breakthrough could then be exploited. So that's going to be the same kind of idea here. But also on the flip side of that, you could be taking a look at those initial Vicksburg assaults and say, wow, they didn't really work. So if you are Sherman, you're drawing off that experience, maybe you should have actually taken a look at the result of that action, and maybe you would have applied it to the same attack here. Well-entrenched Confederates, albeit you're probably also thinking it's the same thought process as Vicksburg, where you are thinking that maybe this army is demoralized, Johnson's not going to be very aggressive at all, and maybe an attack is going to end the campaign sooner. Morgan L. Smith's division would throw themselves at Pigeon Hill following the artillery. Giles Smith's command and Lightburn would push Confederate skirmishers under French away and then press on Francis Cockrell and his Missouri troops who were stationed on the hill itself. Heavy hand-to-hand fighting would erupt between the Ohio regiments under Lightburn and the 63rd Georgia, a regiment recently arrived from coastal duty. Cockrell's command would stall the attack, Smith's division taking casualties before being repulsed. A color bearer of the 55th Illinois was reported to have carried the colors missing an arm, returning to a rally point before dying from loss of blood, characterizing the fiercer fighting in this region. Mortimer Leggett's command would feint in their sector of the line, actually taking the rebel rifle pits. In this sector, Leggett was linking up with the cavalry, who had refused their line to protect the flank. On top of being the end of the line, the Union troops would have to assault higher ground, and were faced with the Confederate artillery, which deterred any further attacks. McPherson's army had failed in their assaults, and supposed weak point at Pigeon Hill was actually strong, with Union attackers reportedly not getting closer than 10 yards. The 4th Corps would have a turn to attack the rebels further down the line, as would the 14th under Palmer. Howard would array his command into columns to attack the enemy, his men at the disadvantage of being broken by the Union skirmish line before advancing across a valley and then attacking the well-placed Confederate works. The 125th Ohio under Updike would form a skirmish line, along with regiments from other brigades, and scatter their Confederate counterparts. Wagner and Harker of Newton's division would lead their men straight at Patrick Cleburne's command. The Union troops were able to advance close to the Confederate works before being forced to hug the ground, as they were subject to small arms and artillery fire. Harker would then try to rally his command, still mounted, the only officer in the charge to do so. He would be hit in the arm, the ball passing into his chest, a wound that would prove mortal. The Union troops would withdraw back to their own lines, Oliver Howard apparently very worried about a counterattack. He would rally some men at the skirmish line, hoping they would stop any Confederate thrust. Wagner's brigade fared no better, his men also being caught up in the undergrowth. Cleburne, for his part, did have veteran troops that were in solid earthworks, so the attack was going to be tough as it was. We have a Union account from a member of Harker's brigade. Between 8 and 9 o'clock, we formed in column by division to attack the rebel works in cooperation with Davis's division connecting to us on the right. Move forward in double quick to within 30 or 40 yards of their works with pieces uncapped and bayonets fixed. The enemy opened a murderous fire on us with such effect that our commanders deployed their regiments as best they could and resorted to use of powder and lead instead of the bayonet as was intended. Our men lay down and fought them for nearly an hour when Davis's division on our right gave way, compelling us, of course, to do the same. While we were fighting them, we compelled them to keep their heads down. But when we gave way, they rose up and poured a murderous fire into our backs. Our men rushed back like an immense herd of infuriated buffaloes running over and trampling each other underfoot. I was run over and badly bruised, but glad to get off so well. Our regiment lost 39 killed and wounded. Our brigade lost a great many valuable officers, including its excellent commander, Charles G. Harker, who received a wound while endeavoring to lead his men over the rebel works, from the effects of which he did in a few hours. The loss of the brigade was 231 killed and wounded. Each of the other 2 brigades of our division lost about the same. Davis's division is said to have suffered more severely than ours. About noon, we marched back to where we came from this morning. Colonel Dunlap being sick and exhausted from his exertions in the charge, the command of the regiment devolved upon me. A little after dark, our regiment went out onto the front line to support skirmishers. Lay here all night listening to the shrill, panther-like screech of sharpshooters' balls. So we have a very brief account of the attack there in Harker's command, and a couple of things to note, I suppose, from this account is that it does not last particularly long. Kennesaw Mountain is not a long affair. It's over pretty quickly in terms of Civil War battles, right? There's not a whole lot of moving parts here. It's pretty straightforward. The other thing I do like to mention here is that there is a mention of having your weapon uncapped, and that is a common thing that we have talked about, whether it's Emory Upton's charges in the main theater of the war. But there's this thought process that part of the problem as to why these attacks on these fixed positions do not work is that the common soldiers are stopping to fire their weapons. So if we make sure that they do not have their caps on their weapons, they're not as likely to stop and fire, so they can just continue moving forward. And that's kind of the goal here, right, is that we have these masses of men that continue to move forward, and that way we can take casualties. Of course, there's going to be some losses associated with this kind of attack, but we're going to be moving forward, and we're going to hopefully be able to take their earthwork to penetrate the line, and then any troops that are coming in behind can then exploit that breakthrough, as we kind of saw at Spotsylvania. So that is another interesting point that we should make here from this account. We also have an account from the Confederate perspective. At about 10 a.m., the enemy charged our works. They had 2 lines of skirmishers and 3 lines of battle in front of our brigades, and 7 lines of battle in front of Cheatham's division. We had only 4 brigades engaged. Manny's and Vaughn's of Cheatham's division Polk, and Lowry of Cleburne's division. The enemy came within 5 feet of our breastworks, and the slaughter was terrific, as our troops literally mowed them down. We only lost 12 killed and wounded in our brigade. The enemy could not stand the steady fire of our troops, and in a few moments fell back to their breastworks, except in front of Manny's brigade, where it is reported they are fortifying in 50 yards of our lines. About half an hour later, the charge, our brigade stopped skirmishing and called the enemy to stop and come and get their dead and wounded that were in the woods, as the heavy firing had set the dry leaves on fire, and the wounded were in danger of being burnt up. During the armistice, I succeeded in getting 90 rifles from the field. Some of them were Henry Patton 16 shooters. This last part here, that's actually a point of contention among the Union troops, is that there is this truce that is called to save the wounded of the Union Army who has attacked the position. And on the outside, that's kind of seeming like a very humanitarian thing to do. However, there is a alternative motive for the rebels in that there's a lot of weapons out there. There's a lot of supplies that have been left in front of them, and they want to make sure they can get it without taking on any kind of sharpshooter fire. So some of the attacking regiments did have Henry repeating rifles, and some of these are picked up by the Confederates during this armistice. The other thing I do want to mention too here in connection with Cleburne and Maney and Cheatham's division, and the mention here and how rapid their fire was, in some places the front rank would actually be past rifles. They would be sent rifles to the front, and they would just continue up a pretty heavy fire in this fashion on the Union troops. Now, that's not to say that there was not any kind of fatalities on the Confederate side with the Union troops getting fairly close. Actually, Sam R. Watkins does have a pretty great account of this in his memoir Company H that we reviewed a while back in the Patreon. But he does mention how one of his good friends in his unit in his Tennessee regiment is killed during this action. So it is not entirely one-sided. Daniel McCook of Jefferson C. Davis's brigade would attack the dead angle proper. Prior to the assault, McCook apparently was reciting a poem of Horatius, who defended Rome by fighting on a bridge, sacrificing himself so that Rome could be saved. Now, if my superior was saying a poem that, in my opinion, is probably implying that we're about to sacrifice ourselves, that might not be a good morale boost for me personally, moving into this kind of attack. However, I'm sure it was a different time, and maybe it would have inspired some individuals. Some of the regimental commanders, though, would not relate exactly what the plan was, as they knew that the odds were stacked against them. McCook's command would be able to break through the terrain and get to the parapet of the works, though. One account had the Confederate artillery actually blowing a hole in the abattis to a point where a soldier exclaimed, "My God, they're firing sticks at us." McCook would stand with his foot on the earthworks, attempting to get his men up and into them. A Confederate would then fire point blank, killing another fighting McCook. Oscar Harmon of the 125th Illinois would also be killed shortly after taking the brigade command, his 125th being the front regiment in the assault. As McCook would be carried to the rear, he would curse fellow brigade commander Robert Mitchell for not supporting him properly. In fact, he would threaten a court-martial, although McCook would not live long enough to do that. Mitchell's men would also attack, but they would meet the same fate, although they would get close to the Confederates on Cheatham's Hill. Some of the action would be at very close range. This is actually where we have Sam R. Watkins and his account. This probably would have been the attack that got fairly close. And he would write about how his gun barrel would glow red from all the shots he fired. The 112th Ohio would suffer heavy casualties, but they would, along with survivors from their own brigade and that of McCook, hold the crest to the hill. Exposing oneself would prove deadly, and they would dig in. The action in this sector would then die down. Sherman would ask Thomas if continuing an attack was feasible. Thomas would reply eventually that it was not, although there was controversy to his reply. Some would think Sherman was more than willing to continue the slaughter. However, he was more than likely just asking about the feasibility of an attack. Thomas was criticized for being overcautious, and he was correct in thinking well-entrenched veteran Confederates would need to be rendered rather than taken, but Sherman was not willing to take time to conduct a siege. Already, he would be planning a move, as the most important part of the battle was that Schofield advanced 2 miles to overlook the rebel works and threatened to get at Marietta. There was smaller scale skirmishing, and Red Jackson's cavalry would give way without much of a fight, but this would have big dividends for Sherman. As it was, though, the Union troops suffered some 3,000 casualties compared to maybe 700 Confederates. This would be a smaller affair when you look at the battles in the main theater. However, we can see parallels with, say, Cold Harbor. In that battle, the Union Army attacked via frontal assault in very similar circumstances. While the situation on the ground was perhaps fairly similar, we do have to take into account the morale of the troops as well, though, that by the time this Cold Harbor assault is being launched, there's already been tremendous loss of life on the part of the Army of the Potomac, so they're not necessarily going to be in the right mindset to take these rebel works. It's a very different kind of mindset, probably at Kennesaw Mountain, and yet you have the same results. There would be some who would point out that Sherman would not keep hitting the anvil with a hammer, but he would wish to continue to avoid the entrenched rebels. Sherman was also aware, though, oddly enough, of the difference in his campaign and Grant's, and actually wrote as such at the time. In the aftermath of the Battle of Cold Harbor, there would be a truce. Sherman wanted to move away from the railroad, and so he would need time to gather supplies, and so the dead would be buried. So at Kennesaw Mountain, there would be a truce called as well. The two sides would mill about, but soon the action would continue. Mining operations were considered, with the Confederates placing a drum with pebbles as a countermeasure. The Confederates would have fireballs made of cotton and hand grenades sent to the front. With Schofield in a position to flank him yet again, Johnson would need to pull back from the Kennesaw line, despite having thrown back Sherman's only frontal assault of the campaign. With Sherman's troops advancing using the railroad as a supply base, Johnson would wish for force to arrive and disrupt this line. Jefferson Davis, it should be said, was growing very dissatisfied with Johnson, who was already in rocky terms with the Confederate president. There had been very little fighting, especially when compared to the main theater. Davis was already trying to come up with an alternative to Johnson, as the Confederates again would try to form a line, and Sherman would try to catch them before they escaped. Hooker would get his men in the way of Howard, who had to countermarch, thus wasting time that could have been made spent on the heels of the Confederate army. Hooker, of course, had thrown Howard under the bus in 1863, blaming him for the loss at Chancellorsville, so this must have been fresh on everyone's mind. The United States flag would fly over Little Kennesaw by July 3rd, and by the 5th, the Confederates would have their backs to the Chattahoochee River. Johnson had fallen back to Smyrna, while more defenses were made. The Georgia militia would have to move up and actually briefly engage the corps of Schofield and McPherson. While in these actions, it was actually mostly cavalry doing the work on part of the Union Army, there was still a threat, a serious threat to the flanking of the Confederate line. In particular, Hood would be victimized by a potential attack, and so he would update his army commander. Johnson had turned to Francis Shoup, who had built several log and earth forts north of the Chattahoochee. From there, it was reasoned a defense could be mounted, so that the Key River did not have to be given up. The Confederates had a mixed reception of the forts, and to be fair, their confidence was shaken at Johnson by this point as well. With Sherman closing in, the supplies were being sent across the river. Johnson was not going to be able to prevent a large army such as Sherman from crossing the Chattahoochee. The manpower simply was not there. As it was, by July 5th, the Union forces could see Atlanta in the distance, despite the loss at Kennesaw. Their goal was finally in sight. So we will wrap up things for now. We have continued the Atlanta campaign with Pine Mountain, Kolb's Farm, and a bloody affair at Kennesaw Mountain. Afterwards, we continued the movements of the two armies as they get closer to Atlanta. Next week, we're going to change gears slightly. We need to mop up on any events we may have glossed over or missed. This will take us all over. We will head to Kentucky to check in on John Hunt Morgan, and then see what's going on in Arkansas. In one of the more famous naval events of the Civil War, we also need to go abroad, all the way to France, where we could say goodbye to the CSS Alabama. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Once again, feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.